Hello, folks. Welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today, we are talking about Dune Part 2. And I'm so happy to say this is probably going to be the first of a number of episodes we're doing about this movie and story and all the many aspects to it. And I can't think of anyone better to kick off our conversations with than Professor Matthew Kapell. As we have learned by the many times Matthew's been on this podcast, Professor Capel is an expert in anthropology, mythology, basically anything ethology. We seem to be able to find some expertise from the good professor. And as it seems that your campus is one of the few in this country that's not currently being torn apart by protesters, go protesters. Matthew, I'm so glad to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Matthew. It's really nice to be here. This is an incredibly important book and I think a great movie, so I'm kind of excited.
Awesome, awesome. Well, and so let me start just by saying, let me do that again. Well, let me start just by asking before we even talk about the movie, as I know you have read this book and I think the book series many, many times. Tell me more about your why you love this book, why you think it's so important.
So sometimes you think books are really important because of where they fall in your own life, I would say. And I first read Dune when I was in sixth grade and probably didn't understand a word of it. It was very much over my head. And every single time I've read it since then, I've been more knowledgeable about Islam. And every single time I've read it since then, I've been more aware of how much Islam is in this book. And it makes it
Yeah.
just an amazingly good book to me. It's
Yeah.
um, and it manages to pull it off quite well, even though it more or less plagiarizes a number of sources. I think it's an utterly fantastic novel, and also is a novel that has my, I think I'm going to say, all-time favorite final line of a novel. So it means a lot to me.
I can see that. I can see that. Well, and that's great because with superhero ethics now, we're trying to move away from just doing like reviews and overall views and really trying to dig down on specific topics. And with this one, we're going to be digging down on a couple of different directions with this movie and this book. And I imagine that every episode we're gonna, cover some of the same ground. But Matthew, I especially wanted to get you on because, like, I know that you have put so much thought into, and we've had so many great discussions about religion, about mythology, about destiny, and the way those things play out. And that is obviously a huge part of this movie and this story. And a point that I think often gets, there's a lot of controversy, not even controversy, but a lot of discussion about what does Herbert mean and how does the movie convey it and all that kind of stuff. So let me just start by, for those who have not been lucky enough to hear you before, can you just give like the 30-second, your background in questions of mythology and religion and all that sort of thing?
Certainly. So my name is Matthew Kapell. I'm an anthropologist and a historian. My PhD is in American Studies, though. And the area I've studied mostly for myth is contemporary stories. My PhD work, which did get published, is about the myth of the frontier in the 1960s. So it's about NASA and Vietnam and Star Trek. So very much I'm a historian. And when I look at Dune, I think history as much as mythology. But I've looked at everything
Right.
from Star Trek and Star Wars as myth to Batman as myth. And thinking about the way we
Yeah.
use myth to create meaning in our lives is the area I'm most interested in.
Yeah. And I think that's so interesting because I think that one of the key elements of this book and something that the second part of the movie really drives home is that not only is that like I think a lot of times you get a story where there just is existing mythology and then the characters are figuring out how they respond to that. This one though is going a lot deeper because, one of the central themes is okay, but where is mythology? Instead of just saying like, oh, the chosen one will come or whatever it is, there's a real discussion over some of the characters in this book fully believe and in the movie fully believe in prophecy. Some of them are aware that prophecy and mythology were not just, naturally occurring, but were very intentionally seeded in some ways. And some characters therefore want to act on it, and some characters are very hesitant about that. How do you feel about this kind of book taking that like second step into these questions?
I think that's the great strength of the book. Um, we are really good in our culture, and we have been for more than a century, at doing savior narratives. And this is because of the broad influence of Christianity. Um, and this book, well, it adheres to a quote from Frank Herbert that he makes much later, which is, I wanted people to be afraid of charismatic leaders. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's exactly what both films are about. Um, a charismatic leader becoming charismatic and becoming not the good guy as a result. And it does a great job in discussing that. At the same time, it does a great job at discussing from almost a Marxian perspective how myth is a tool used to control people. And if you're,
Mm.
I would say, here's a quote from my PhD: "The unexamined myth is not worth believing."
Say more about that.
If you, um, we all have myths. Let's define myth. Myth is an ideology, a point of view in a story. So an ideology in narrative form. And if we don't think about them, if we just accept them, suddenly we are just accepting all of the things that myth reinforces, like gender roles, like class
Right.
systems, like notions of good police forces as um, being heroic in their activities, even when they break the rules. And when we think about myth, think about stories that give us points of view, we have to think about what that means to us. Or we don't change
Yeah.
anything in our contemporary society. And considering how many people are camping out on campuses right now trying to change things in our contemporary society, is very much about myth.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a ton of sense. And, one of the things that I have often thought about, it kept striking me how incredibly relevant this book is today and this movie is today. And to me, that's one of the best things I can say about a lot of great science fiction. And, I think like a lot of books from its time, there are parts of it that haven't aged as well. And that I think that the movie did a much better job of updating. And we'll talk about more of that in a different episode. But, just uh, the way that the book shows that the Harkonnens are, horrible and terrible, pretty homophobic and fat shaming, and they kinda make it a lot better, I think, in the movies, but still just like, if you think about all of the myths that are today being challenged, the myths about what does gender mean, and the myths about, what is America, and was America great in the past, or can it be great in the future? Um, I know I've spoken with a lot of, my Jewish relatives who were, people who, were born and came of age in the '40s and or '50s, and they learned the myth of Israel as this wonderful shining beacon. And maybe there was a lot of truth to it at the time. Maybe there wasn't, but there certainly is a lot of people wrestling with it now. And our whole country, I think, is wrestling now with how do we see, brave little Israel and things like that. And I think that happens all over the place. I love how you point out like the myths of Star Trek and things like that. Every time you get a character who's cast in a new way, there's the myth of, well, but wait, Star Trek is supposed to always have been this, whether it was always the most liberal thing in the world, and so we can't critique it, or no, it was always all about straight white men, and so why are all these women running around or stuff like that?
I completely agree. And so here's where we stand in America right now. We're in the middle of some social upheaval that might change the outcome of an election pretty soon. And most of that social upheaval is revolving around the way we think of Israel and Palestine and human rights and the inalienable human rights and what a shining city on a hill actually means. Um, and
Yeah.
and these are things that need to be examined. My undergraduate degree is from the University of Michigan at Dearborn, in Dearborn, Michigan, which is the most Arab American city in the United States. It is incredibly diverse in its Arab population, but it is full of Arabs and Palestinians and Egyptians and some Persians. Very Sunni, a lot of Shia too. And the University of Michigan Dearborn is not having protests right now
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
because they don't feel they need to. Everybody knows what they think. Um,
Yeah. That's fair.
so
Well,
yes, go.
And I promise we'll get back to Dune in a second. I just wanna add one more thing that I think, certainly I am going through, and I think a lot of other people who are the children of people who were in college in the '60s are going through. I grew up with mythology of the '60s, and I know my mother was at Columbia the last time they had protests like this, and she always told me, and growing up, I remember saying to her, like, "Oh, I wish I was living through a time like that." And she'd be like, "Be careful. It's not as pretty as it's often made out to be." The kind of wonder yearsification of that era. And I think a lot of us today are like, "Oh yeah, no, this is much uglier." All right, well, getting back to the book then, let's talk about what is the role of mythology in shaping a people? Because I think one of the things that is really central to this book, and especially to part two of the movie, is the role that mythology plays for the Fremen in like their identity of themselves, and of course all the ways they react to Paul and Jessica. Um, and we'll get into the specifics, but just talk a little bit in general, like what is it that mythology does in terms of national or group or whatever it is, self identity?
Well, what mythology does is it gives you a system of shared stories that provide meaning to your group, that the group that you're part of. So let's make it simple. Um, New York Jets fans have a mythology, and that
Yeah,
mythology makes them New York Jets fans. And when they meet other New York Jet fans, they have that shared mythology, which gives them a shared vocabulary, which gives them an instant friendship and camaraderie. And that's what myth does. That is exactly the purpose of myth, and exactly the power
yeah.
of myth. And I
And
don't
I
know
think
anything about
oh, go ahead.
professional football, but the New York Jets do. They're really bad, right?
Yes, and he is pointing out, they're pointing out that I am a New York Jets fan, and that's part of the conversation here. But I think that's really important, and I also think that that's actually a great way to get to an essential thing is here is that you don't all have to agree on the myth. The fact is, if I meet a New York Jets fan and we start talking, we might start talking about was, Namath the best quarterback we've ever had? Probably, but some people might disagree. We might start talking about was Rex Ryan a good coach? I happen to think he really was. Other people have different views. Or how do we remember Mark Sanchez? And the fact is, many people may disagree with each other, but if I start talking to someone who's not a Jets fan, like if I ask you, Professor Capel, what is your opinion on Mark Sanchez? Uh, you and I aren't going to be able to engage on that. I'm guessing. And so yeah, I think that that's a really key idea is that we can share a mythology even if we don't always agree on it.
Let's put it in explicitly religious terms. I don't know who Mark Sanchez is, by the way, but explicitly
I figured.
religious terms. And I don't mean to be insulting of religion. I think of religion as a subset of myth. There's lots of Christians who disagree with the exact nature of with each other about the exact nature of the Trinity. This doesn't mean they're not Christians. It means they have different interpretations of what the Trinity is and how it worked and what it's about. Um, that discussion of what the myth does and why it's important, that debate about what the Trinity is amongst Christians, is a way that myth reinforces the broader scope of Christianity. It gives people who
Right.
are Christians a thing to discuss, the same way people who are Jets fans can discuss the only name in Jets history I know, Joe Namath, and have an opinion.
Yeah.
And there's been a huge point in most of world history in which religious differences lead to death and destruction. But quite often it's just like casual debate and proof that you're both in the same group. And it's an in group, out group
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Like, I think that's so true. Many wars have been fought over literally, is the Trinity this or is the Trinity that? Or is, who is the true last prophet in Islam or any of these things. At the same time, today, the United Methodist Church, one of the largest of the global Protestant churches, is having their annual meeting, and they're fighting really hard to find a way to acknowledge that they fundamentally disagree on some topics, but to still hold themselves in communion with each other because that's important to them. Um, so pulling all this back to Dune, what is the role of mythology for the Fremen people?
I'm going to answer that.
And especially in terms of let's focus on how it's expressed in the movie.
I'm going to step back from that just slightly in the beginning of my answer um,
Go for it.
to mention that one of the things you discussed in a previous episode, I think with your brother-in-law, was the Muslim influence in Dune and how many of the words in the films and the book are of Arabic origin, and that is all correct. But one of the other places that Dune pulled from, really in a way that most people who noticed think it was plagiarized, but most people don't really pay attention to, is a book that came out in 1960 called The Sabres of Paradise, which was by a British travel writer named Leslie Branch. I want to call it a history, and it's a history of the Chechen wars of independence in the middle of the 19th century against the Russians. Um,
Mhm.
it is a history of the Imam Shamil fighting the Tsarist Russia in the middle for Chechen and Muslim Chechen independence. And the way the war was constructed was along the lines of Muslim um, mythology. Um, and the book itself is the plot of Dune. I mean, it has
Mm.
direct quotes from the book are in Dune. In Dune, somewhere it says, "Wisdom comes from the cities," and no, "Polish comes from the cities, and wisdom from the desert." And in "Savors of Paradise," it says, um, "Polish comes from the cities, and wisdom from the mountains." I mean, it's like that direct. They have the exact
Right.
same quotes leading into the discussion of Muad'Dib versus Shamil, and all of the words that they use that aren't Arabic are Chechen words. The names of their knives are kinjal. That's a Chechen kind of knife that was worn. Um, Shamil calls the Tsar in Russia not the Tsar; he calls him the Padishah. Um,
Huh.
the
Okay.
definition of a regional governor to the Chechens was a Siridar, and technically the title of the Baron Harkonnen is Siridar Baron. I mean, this book is just utterly stolen from, and I will
Right.
put it this directly. Um, there is a moment when Shamil, this great Muslim leader, who's building on a Muslim mythology of what it means to rebel against non-Muslims, um, says quite Branch says quite clearly that to understand, um, to begin writing about Shamil, she says, we must first place him in his time, the first half of the 19th century, and then his place, the mountains. The beginning of the book Dune starts, to begin your study of the life of Muad'Dib, then take care to first place him in his time, born in the 57th year of the Padishah Emperor, Shaddam IV, and then take most special care that you locate Muad'Dib in his place, the planet Arrakis. It's basically the same quote.
Wow.
And so when we talk about the mythology that's inherent in Dune, and I could go on and on about all of the things that are pulled from this book that end up in Dune and are in the movies, um, it's not an Arab mythology. It's a Chechen and Dagestani mythology, which is different than Arab mythology. And too many people spend a lot of
Mhm.
time going, you know, this is about the Lisan al Gaib, which is not really a term in Arabic Islam. It's a term of Persian Islam. In fact, it was used to describe a poet from Persia. Um, so the Arab influences are great, but they're not really as central as people keep making out. And the
Right.
Chechen mythology is very specific. The fight against the outsiders is a fight against the outsiders who don't share your religion. And in order to win, you must kill them all. Um, the 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 Chechens who fought in this revolution in the 19th century and were completely destroyed by it. Though the Chechens still talk about it, it's still part of their national mythology. Um, they had knife fights amongst each other all the time in exactly the way they happen in Dune. In fact, in the novel Dune,
Mm.
those family fights are called kanli, which is a Chechen word for fights among clans that last 3 or 4
Right.
generations. Um, and so this is an essential mythology to the Chechens that works this way. Um, the fight against the outside other must be a fight for our religion, thus making this fight a jihad. Or in the words of the film, which I think was a pretty good change, a crusade. Um, and that mythology works in Dune really, really well because um,
Mhm.
it's not precisely a white savior narrative. It's important to remember that Harkonnen is a Finnish name, and Atreides, just to be clear on its origin, is a Greek name. Um, Paul is
Right.
described as being olive skinned a number of times. The name Atreides is derived from the Greek name Atreus, who's the father of Agamemnon in the Iliad.
Mm.
And
Right.
all of Atreus's descendants are known as Atreidae. Um,
And I should say in later books, they make clear that Leto,
is
like,
it is
because all of this is people from Earth, and it's made clear that that the whole Atreides line is thought to be direct descendant of Agamemnon in Greece, however many thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago.
yeah, and yeah, Agamemnon makes a quick um, showing in the book God Emperor of Dune and is just confused by what's going
Yeah,
on and kind of his consciousness disappears.
of course.
Which, yeah, seems pretty
Well, let
reasonable.
let me let me interrupt you there because I can see where you're going with other things, but there's so much I want to talk about here already. And I will say I knew none of that going in, and I'm so glad you brought it up. And I think it's so interesting that it's never talked about, especially because, and I think this is important because I think some people may listening and thinking, "Wait a minute, but isn't science fiction always like or often retelling of current situations or historical situations in a new setting?" And I think that is true. And I think that, for example, you know, many science fiction books are very clearly the Vietnam War, but in space, or the Iraq War in space, or what's happening now in space. And I think that would definitely not be thought of as plagiarism. That's just part of what science fiction does. But it's sort of it would be more like if someone did we're going to tell Vietnam in space, but this Vietnam history book someone wrote, we're just going to steal exact lines from it, and that's where the plagiarism comes in.
Exactly. The Vietnam
Yeah,
in Space book is The Forever War by Joe Haldeman, which is also in
yeah,
my PhD work. And it
hmm
is an amazing novel. Right now we have the
yeah,
Foundation series on Apple TV. It's really bad, but that was based on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Um, this is
yeah,
the way this kind of stuff usually works. I don't.
yeah,
When I say I think Herbert plagiarized, I do think he plagiarized, but not in a truly horrendous way, because when you're basing a narrative on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, which is a mythic structure, most of your
hmm
readers know what the hell you're talking about. In this case, Dune readers didn't know anything about this history. Um, so
right,
just pulling the lines actually make the lines read more true. And he admitted it. So
yeah,
I don't think it's a negative form of plagiarism in the way I would normally take somebody out
right.
and shoot them for plagiarizing. Um, Seriously. But but it is line for line quite often. There are poems in both books
Yeah.
that are almost identical. It's kind of weird. Um,
Listeners, if you know, I don't want to get lost in this question, but like, and I'm going to do some research myself to see, like, did Herbert say like, oh yeah, and you should buy this other book, and like that's where I got all this from. Um, let's go back though to the Fremen people themselves then. So, what do you see as the role that mythology is playing for them in this movie?
so let's talk about the Fremen religion and how it derives from this book, The Sabers of Paradise, in many ways, but not completely. The Fremen religion is theoretically called Zen Sunni. And a lot of the religions in Dune um, are conglomerations of existing religions on Earth today. So there's these Zen Sunni wanderers. Shamil in the Sabers of Paradise is a Sufi, not a Sunni, and that's a different kind of Islam. But it's a more mystical one in the way that Zen is a more mystical version of Buddhism. So it works pretty well. And in the United States, we tend to think of Sunni Islam as the more traditional form of Islam, and Shia Islam is not. Um, but
Right.
that's a very Orientalist way to put it. And Sunni Islam is a little bit more insular, I would say. And
Right.
the Fremen are a lot more insular. So the way their religion works for them is it creates a coherent sense of identity about who they are and why their lives suck so bad and why that's good. Um, why the
Right.
difficulty of living on Arrakis, which is a planet 20 light years from Earth, and hot and without water. Why that is a They say that Arrakis was created to test the faithful. Is a line from the book. I think it's in one of the films. And so their religion becomes a thing that helps them build a sense of community. What's interesting about Dune 2 is then they split that community really, really quickly into the Southern fundamentalists and everybody else, which is not in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul goes south in the book to have consume the water of life and become the Kwisatz Haderach. But there's no indication that those in the South are somehow more fundamentalist in their religion. And I
Right.
think it was a genius move to change that. It was a beautiful
Very
thing to
much so.
do. Um, Not just because Southern fundamentalists scared the hell out of me, but because creating complexity in the religion of the Fremen was a good idea. Because it created
Yeah.
the ability to understand that religion in a less stereotyped way.
I think that's really true. And again, this is going to be the specific topic of the second episode we do on this. But I think that there's a lot of things, especially where there are points that you can get across through writing that I think are often harder to get across in film. And often that's like in writing, you go deep enough into a character's and a people's, you know, understanding of themselves that it's possible to sort of be critical of them. But on film, especially when we're not specifically told these are the bad guys, when people are saying, "Here's my ideology," like, we kind of have been taught where that the movie is telling us it's okay to like these people. And I think that the by giving the idea that it's not all the Southerners, not everyone is like that, there are other people, not only, as you said, does it allow the idea that religions are not, monosyllabic, not monosyllabic, monovocal, that they don't all speak with one voice, that there's controversy internally, but it allows us, the audience, to sort of be like, "Oh, okay, I wonder where I am in this," because we're seeing 2 different sides represented. Matthew has to step away for just a second, so perfect time to do this. We're starting the conversation, but we want to hear from you. Send your thoughts, questions, or anything else you want to hear us discuss to feedback@theethicalpanda.com, or you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok under The Ethical Panda. You can even chat with us on Discord or Facebook. Find those links in the show notes or on our website, theethicalpanda.com. And if you like this content, why not become a member? You get early access to ad-free episodes for all podcasts in the Ethical Panda family, along with bonus content at the end of most episodes, plus member-only episodes. And it's just $5 a month, or $55 for a full year. Sign up at theethicalpanda.com or through the link in the show notes. And now, back to our episode. Welcome back. So, the last thing I was going to say about why I think this southern-northern break is so good is that it also, as I know you and I have talked about before, religion and mythology, especially when it comes to your people and others, is directly shaped by how much contact you're having with others. And one of the things that is never explicitly said, but I think you can easily derive, is that all the people who are in the South, they're not having any contact with the Harkonnens. That means they're not being actively oppressed by the Harkonnen. They're in a pretty terrible state in that the world is this total desert, and they have this dream of the Greenlands that once were and can be again, but they're not dealing with that active right now problem. And you said at the very beginning, and I think this is a common theme in critique of religion, especially messianic religions or religions where even if it's not a messiah, but there's an idea of like time being linear and that you can suffer now, but that a better time is coming. That's a really good way to get people to accept suffering. And so it makes a lot of sense that the people in the more northern areas who aren't like, they have a lot of these beliefs, but they're not quite so locked into them, are a lot more willing to say, no, we're not just going to like passively accept Harkonnen rule. We're not just going to passively accept all this. We're gonna fight back.
I'm not sure how you want me to comment to that, though. That is exactly true, but that's also the reasons that religions that posit a paradise in the future work so well, right?
Right.
Um, and that's what the Fremen hypothesize. Um, though
Yeah.
uniquely, what's interesting compared to existing religions, and mostly the Abrahamic traditions, but the others as well. Um, what's interesting is they think they have to work at it, which I kind of adore about them. They're not just waiting for God to
Mm.
show up and fix everything. They're capturing water and creating big cisterns of it so that they can um, remake the face of Arrakis so that it is green. What you don't find out in the
Right.
films or in the first book is that the reason it's a desert planet is the worms. And if you make it green, you get rid of the worms, and thus you get rid of the spice, which is
Right.
problematic. But I appreciate the fact that they have to actually do the work themselves.
Right. And certainly, and I'm not going to get into a whole religious analysis. There's a lot of people within Christianity, at least, and in some other traditions, who do believe that, but that's another one of those power
Yep.
struggles. Um, so with the Fremen, though, again, I think a lot of people would just say, "Oh yeah, so this myth it just exists, and we're not going to look at the origin of it all." But of course, this book and this part of the movie really establishes this isn't something that just naturally occurred within the Fremen. Talk about the Bene Gesserit and their role in seeding this mythology and this religion.
So we're going to have a HBO. Sorry, they don't exist anymore. A Max show called Sisterhood of Dune, I think, or Dune: The Sisterhood. It should be out next year. It is not based on the Frank Herbert novels. It's based on the novels of his son and Kevin J. Anderson, but it still looks good. Um, quick aside, the producer tweeted not too long ago a picture of all of the books he's looking at as they're writing episodes, and one of them is The Sabers of Paradise, which I thought was kind of awesome to see. In the Dune universe, the Duneverse, as people call it, the Bene Gesserit and another group called the Bene Tililax show up about 10,000 years before Dune happens. A lot of people have been saying this is 10,000 years in the future, but it's actually closer. The setting is closer to 20,000 years in the future. Um,
Mm.
the year 10,191 is a different calendar than ours. It's 10,000 years after the Butlerian Jihad and the founding of the Spacing Guild. And the Butlerian Jihad is when we got rid of all of the artificial intelligences. So at that time, when interstellar travel, but through the use of artificial intelligence, was disappearing, and a new kind of interstellar travel had to be invented. It was invented by what became the Spacing Guild using the spice. At the same moment that that's happening, because it's a huge jihad, it's a huge war amongst multiple planets. It's an interesting side note that most of the places in Dune are about 20 light years away from Earth in different directions, which I've always appreciated.
Right.
And the Bene Gesserit are founded to be a semi-secret power behind the system. Their existence is designed to manipulate religious beliefs for the purpose of extending the survivability of humanity across the universe. And they fail
Right.
spectacularly at it because Paul shows up. And so I would like you to imagine the Bene Gesserit as kind of a sort of, and again, I'll go to Christian theology slash mythology, as kind of a sort of Paul, that is Saul, from the Bible. That Paul.
Right. We're talking here about Saint Paul, the author in theory of
The
I forget again.
epistles,
We're talking here about the Paul of the Bible, the author of the epistles, and like not Paul
yes.
Atreides.
And what that Paul does is, he reformulates what Christianity is to the early believers. Um, Paul is also, as an aside, a really good way to mess with people who tell you that they're against the trans community because of the Bible. because you can just mention Saul and they'll go, you mean Paul? And you can go, oh, so people can change their names. It's perfect.
Yeah.
But yeah, he reinvents what Christianity is. He makes it a far more political tool. He's the reason we have a Catholic Church. He's the reason we have a Roman Empire that turns to Christianity. He's the reason all of Europe and the circum-Mediterranean world before Islam is Christian. And that's what the Bene Gesserit are doing. They're using the available religions to them to affect change in the cultural systems they want to control, because they think their ability to control will be the ability to save humanity. But they need to be in charge when they do it. And that's where the Paul of the films and the novel steps out, because he's not under their control.
Right. And I think that one of the real points here, and I think this is where Herbert is making some really important critiques of religion, is that as I think anytime someone says, I am essential to this good thing happening, then now protecting yourself becomes essential. And so any and all things you do to protect yourself are now morally justified. And, in the movie, we see that the Bene Gesserit are, even if you like, you can say that their goal is to protect humanity, but they're willing to kill an awful lot of humans. They're perfectly happy with this psychotic, sociopathic. They use different terms to describe him, Fade. As long as they can control him, and they're perfectly happy to keep the horrible situation on Dune happening as long as they can control it. Where the idea being the suffering of the Fremen is completely justified because it allows spice travel. And I think here's the real essential part, and that the movie I think really shows and has Paul really driving in. We talked before about that part of the thing that keeps the Fremen from, you know, some of the Fremen are on open revolt, but some of the Fremen are like, no, we just need to wait. We just need to we need to do our part. But the Muad'Dib is no, sorry, not the Lian al Gib is going to come and bring about everything, so we don't have to do it ourselves. The Bene Gesserit told them that thousands and thousands of years ago, and the Bene Gesserit have continued to tell them that. Very much like the Catholic Church told, slaves and the Protestant churches as well, or told the people in any land that was colonized of, don't worry about it. If it seems like the good things are happening to the Europeans and the bad things are all happening to you, don't worry about it, because as long as you are good and you obey your masters, you're going to get to go to heaven. And that's very much what the Bene Gesserit are doing here, and it's what the nature of that control is.
Exactly.
And I love that the movie, I think, is like, compared to the 1985 movie, this movie is so very clear about what the Bene Gesserit are doing.
I think this movie actually understands what Herbert's point was in a way that the 1985 movie didn't. And I think that's important. And I also think it's why having a third film would be an excellent move. There's a joke amongst Dune's fans that go in a number of different ways about the book Dune Messiah, which is the next book, which comes out in 1969 and is much shorter than all of the other books. And it's essentially a book that is a per my last email book. Is a book that goes, if you didn't understand what Dune meant, here, let me make sure you understand what Dune meant. You're wrong. He's not a hero. And it's overwhelmingly pointed in that. And a number of people online apparently are very upset that Paul is not the hero. And they've all read Dune, and it's kind of weird. But it does give us an indication of how very strong that hero's narrative is in our culture. That people want to see Paul like the 1985 Paul, where he is the Kwisatz Haderach bringing freedom to the Fremen, or as Luke Skywalker or something. And he's not that. He's a cautionary tale about why that's bad. And so Dune Messiah does that exactly. It goes, no, you didn't get it. He's horrible now. Because he decides that he can justify whatever he does based on it's for the greater good. And in that novel, so the Holocaust isn't really called the Holocaust until the late 50s. It's usually called the Shoah or the tragedy or something. But it starts to become called the Holocaust in the late 50s. because of a book called While 6 Million Died. And it's a great book. I used to study the Holocaust a lot. And so in 1969, when Herbert specifies exactly how many people die in Paul's jihad, it's very specifically listed as 60 billion. It's not 55
Right.
billion, it's not 68 billion, it's 60 billion in the way 6 million died was talking about the Holocaust. So you were supposed to get quite strongly through that we're talking about somebody who's not on the side of the people, but is justifying his
Yeah.
behaviors by saying he is.
And I'll just say now, again, with the movie really doing that so much better, I'm gonna say a lot more about this in the next episode, but I think it's why it is essential that Chani is against
Oh
Paul,
yes.
because that doesn't happen in the book, but I think it's because audiences need someone to root for, and then it gives the audience a surrogate of someone to be against Paul.
Or not
And
necessarily root for, but just to see that viewpoint. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. Um, and yeah, I think that's what is part of what is so fascinating about this is because you mentioned before that like calling it a white savior narrative isn't entirely accurate. And I like that they show great racial diversity among the Fremen. And of course, you know, uh God, what's the name of the actor who played Leto Atreides?
Oscar
It's not
Isaac.
Pablo Picasso, it's Oscar Isaac. And of course, Timothy Chalamet, I think, identifies as white. I'm not positive, but I know that his father, Duke Leto, who's portrayed by Oscar Isaac, who's a Guatemalan. Um, but if it's not a white savior narrative, it is very much a colonizer narrative.
Yes.
It is very much the idea of that person from the outside, and um here, actually, I don't want to get too far into the Chechen thing, but I'm curious: is there a character in that history who is like a Russian who comes to be kind of like dances with wolves with the Chechens and winds up being a heroic figure for
Nope.
them?
And in fact,
Okay, so that again is
if one showed up, they would not have accepted. I'm going to say him.
yeah,
They would have killed him. In Dune Messiah and in the Sabers of Paradise, it's pointed out that their enemies are skinned alive and drums are made from their skins. That's the way they treated
right.
the Russians. The biggest divergence between the two
And,
books is that Shamil is locally born, and
yeah,
that's where at least part of his strength comes from.
right. And again, you see that because yeah, left on their own, the Fremen probably would have no idea of, oh yes, we should take up this, look for the outsider, the one who is not Fremen but is Fremen. Um, but of course, it's again because the Bene Gesserit have planted that
Mm-hmm.
idea, and they do that again very specifically because they want someone like Paul. It's just that they can't control Paul the way that they had hoped.
Yes. So there is out there in the world, and I can't give you a direct cite, a master's thesis on Dune that I read a number of years ago. And it's really great. And it has this one line that I remember, which was something along the lines of what's strange about Dune that we have to pay attention to is that it is incredibly respectful of Islam while at the same time being an Orientalist narrative. And
Mm,
and and
yeah,
and that is a product of when it was written, as much as the
right.
homophobia is a product of when it was written, um, and the fat shaming is a product of when it was written. Um, Frank Herbert was a serious homophobic. He was estranged from his gay son for most of that son's adult life.
Oh,
He
it's
was a
terrible.
dick about it. Sorry, um, and um,
No, but he's worse now.
and in the book, the Baron is not his size and his sexuality is not presented quite as violently as it is in the film. In either of the films, his suspensors don't let him float. His suspensors let him kind of traipse around, bouncing from tiptoe to tiptoe through rooms, in a very stereotypical gay kind of movement sort of way, is how it's described.
Yeah,
And that's also a product of its time and a wonderful thing that gets changed in the films. Um, so
yeah.
the whole point
Well,
that that aside
go ahead.
started with was having Chani becomes the most important thing about the second film. First off, increasingly, I think Zendaya is one of the best actors on earth. Everything I've
Yes.
seen her in, she is just completely believable and not Zendaya in. It's kind of weird. And she was utterly fantastic in this. And so my absolute favorite moment of the film, the one that drove it home in a way that the message is not driven home in the novel as effectively, is that the last moment of the film is like 5 seconds on her face. It is
Yeah.
the most important moment. And let me go into like overwhelming detail. As I said at the beginning, my favorite ending line in any novel is the ending line in Dune. Mid-century American science fiction had this long tradition of trick endings. I think of there's a Robert Heinlein short story in which a bunch of guys in a bar are arguing about whether or not we should be exploring space. And the guy who's running the bar is like, "We definitely shouldn't. We've got everything we need. We need to work on where we're already at." And then at the end of this short story, you find out they're having this debate in a bar on the moon. Thus, right?
Yeah.
Or the Arthur C. Clarke short story, The Star, about a Jesuit priest who's completely overwhelmed by his research. Jesuit priests have to have doctoral degrees usually. He's an astrophysicist, and he's on an interstellar mission to explore the remains of a nova. And as he this nova destroyed an entire alien civilization. And then at the end, he realizes it was also the Star of Bethlehem. Those kinds of trick
Okay.
endings are very common in mid-century American science fiction short stories. They don't happen in novels as much, but the ending of Dune, which I cite in classes that I teach on writing all the time, is this. I'm going to quote it. It starts with a Jessica quote. "Think on it, Shani. The princess will have the name, yet she'll live as less than a concubine, never to know the moment of tenderness from the man to whom she's bound. While we, Shani, we who carry the name of the concubine, history will call us wives." And that's the last line of the novel. And it changes the entire meaning of the novel for me. It's problematic in that history will call us wives is a sexist statement about they're being defined by who they're related to, but it also changes the complete narrative of how you look at all of the women in the novel up until that moment. And I was terrified that this was going to be the thing I hated about Dune 2. But the last two people you see in Dune 2 are Jessica and Shani. And they're both just looking at their faces.
And,
And
and not only are these the last two, but the first voice you hear is Princess Irulan.
yes,
And in the books, like you get little excerpts from the books, but you get excerpts from things that she wrote as like chapter headings. But overall, like I don't know if Frank Herbert had an ex and he just like put all of his hatred towards that ex into Princess Irulan, but he hates this character and treats her horrifically through those books. And so to have her be more of that leading voice, I think the narrative voice is really great. And Frances Pugh is also Florence Pugh is also amazing. The only other thing I would say also about what you said is I think it's so important that not only do we end with Chani, but we end with her getting ready to ride a worm. Because again, this whole thing has been about a battle of, what is the truth that defines the Fremen people. And she is right now rejecting what everyone else is saying is the true belief of the Fremen people, that the belief that has made them a people, that holds them together, that has helped them to win this great war, is all the things that she's rejecting. And so to them, she is rejecting being Fremen. And the first thing she does is what is just, like the thing Paul had to do to become truly accepted as Fremen, riding a worm. And I just thought the parallel of that was so beautiful and made so much sense to understanding like the depth of the struggle over what is the mythology of the Fremen people and how does it define who they are by the time of the movie.
and it leaves open the question of where she's going to go, right? Because she can't go south to the fundamentalists. She's got to, and Siege Tabor is destroyed. I forgot to mention, both Siege and Tabor are Tartar words that the Cossacks used. Both of them mean camp. They're both found in the Sabers of Paradise. the Chechens are fighting the Tartars, the Cossacks, the Russian Cossacks, who call their camps sieges, and call their base camps tabors. So that's where the words come from.
This is
Yeah.
amazing.
But she can't go there where she knows there are some people who agree with her because it's gone now. So
Right.
the open-endedness of where the hell is she going to go is also a beautiful moment as a statement about religion. When you realize that your
And I will
faith
say,
differs dramatically, who do you go talk to about it?
yeah. And in our bonus section for members, that's exactly what we're going to talk about: is what would we want to see in a third movie and possibly more after that. But we have been going on for a while. There's a lot of discussions we're going to have. We're definitely going to have Professor Kapell. We're definitely going to have Professor Matthew back, as well as Rob McKenzie, and as mentioned, my brother-in-law Steve Cox, who's also quite a scholar of both Islam and Dune. So, Matthew, let me just ask you: is there any other last comments you want to make about this book, about this movie, especially, and like what it has to say about mythology and destiny and all of that?
We live in a world in which our movies are basically hero narratives, thanks to Star Wars. And every single really important popular film follows the hero's journey now, depending on how it is chosen to be formulated. But we're all living in a world of Luke Skywalkers and Neos. And
And I just want to jump in there for anyone who's about to say, but wait, not all movies are adventure movies. There's actually been some great writing down. I'll see if I can find it on how even most rom-coms today or movies like that, if it's a movie about just a person's self-actualization, it's still framed as a hero narrative. If it's a movie about like, will the character get the girl or get the guy, it's a hero narrative. So yeah, just going on. So just to be clear, we're not just talking about like the actual adventurers fighting against some bad thing.
yeah, it's not always dragons. Sometimes it's the Devil Wears Prada. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Or just your own self-doubt.
yes. And too many of our movies are that way. And the two films that we have in Dune so far are not just criticizing religion or criticizing myth or criticizing the hero's journey. They're criticizing all of contemporary film as a result. And I follow a number of Facebook groups in Dune, and man, they're all still angry about this film. And I'm like, it's spot on, perfect, because it made you angry. So the last thing I would say is, yeah, that is essentially the point, to make us aware that thinking we have a chosen leader who can do no wrong is how we get Donald Trump. It just is. So the unexamined myth is not worth believing.
Just to add a little bit of balance, not that I'm saying that these two are equal in their badness, but I think it's also how people get so mad when we critique Obama for drone strikes.
Yes.
It's the same kind of a thing. And the other thing to me that I think is fascinating in what you're talking about is those people who are so mad, it's probably because they're more invested in the mythology of Dune that has been built up in not the mythology in the story, but their mythology about the book.
Their headcanon.
That has been built up rather than the text itself. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they see
I would
go.
I would bet that if you took a list of like the 100 most angry, problematic, anti-woke people in the Dune groups, and then compared that to a similar list from a Star Trek group, there's going to be at least a 20%.
Oh yes, unquestionably. And man, they're so mean about Zendaya. It really is upsetting. I'm not being racist. She's just a bad actress. Statements.
God.
And it's like, no, you are being racist. And everything that was changed from the book is wrong because it's not homophobic and because it's not sexist, is problematic as well. So the fact that Dune, and especially Dune 2, which I think is the better of the two films, manages so effectively to critique all of contemporary popular culture, is its great strength. And it is the reason you need to have so many episodes on this series. And why I'm looking forward to listening to them. Your brother-in-law is really freaking smart, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more from him. So that's why it's important, because it's not Star Wars, and Star Wars sucks.
Well, that I'm going to strongly disagree with,
That was
but in part because well, I know you did that to trigger me a
yeah.
little bit, not trigger, actually triggering, but like I would just say, guess what? When Star Wars took the character who'd become most mythologized, Luke Skywalker, and said, "What if he wasn't perfect?" The exact same thing happened.
Oh, that is such
So,
a good
and
point. Yeah.
right? Like that's exactly what the Last Jedi did, because again, the mythology of Luke Skywalker, who can do no wrong. So yeah, and I think that's important is that the next 6 months are going to be some of the most hard political of many of our lives. Um, and God only knows what happens after November. And I can understand that a lot of people are going to want respite and escape from that, and that's part of why they turn to these things. And so I want to say, like, we're going to mention that stuff, but we're not going to. It's not going to be the entire focus of this. But because in part because I think that that's the other thing is that the lessons we're talking about like be careful when you say a leader can do no wrong. I don't just mean a political leader. I also mean Filoni or Snyder or not Snyder or anything like that. Like, we hear like the mythology that gets built up. I think Filoni is a phenomenal writer and a phenomenal story builder. And I think Favreau, not Favreau, who's the third of the Disney apps, the one who's at running the MCU. It's Favreau, Filoni, and God, why can I
The
never remember
guy who
his name? He's
always
in our
wears a
help.
hat.
Yeah.
Yeah, now we're both looking it up, aren't we? Kevin Feige.
Right. Feige. Thank you so much. It's Kevin Feige. They all are, I think, incredible and have done so much good in terms of storytelling. They've all made mistakes, and none of them are perfect. And like more recently, when a lot of people have been kind of critical of, the more recent movies of the MCU, I see a lot of people saying, no, Favreau's never done us wrong. You have to just trust Favreau. You have to trust Favreau. You have to trust Favreau. And it's the same. Frank Herbert would say you're just as dumb, or you're just as wrong. Frank Herbert would say you're just as wrong. So thank you, everybody. Professor Kapell, thank you so much for being a part of this. This has been awesome. We're going to have more with you in the bonus section in just a moment. For everybody else, thank you so much for listening. We have spoken. Superhero Ethics is an Ethical Panda podcast, part of the True Story FM network. If you enjoyed the show, please share it and leave a rating or review in your podcast app if possible. The best way to support us is by becoming a member. Find info and social links in the show notes. Thanks for listening.